Last November, San Diego opened the new Blue Line trolley extension, adding 11 more miles to the system. This is a sign of the region's continued recommitment to the streetcar. You might be wondering why I said recommitment just now. Well, because this trolley line already existed back in 1923. The entire system was dismantled in 1949, only to be rebuilt after the 1980s. San Diego was one of the first cities on the western coast with an electric trolley service. Today, it has one of the most robust light rail systems in the entire country. So, what happened? This is the story of how San Diego went without a streetcar for over 30 years. San Diego wasn't one of those cities that saw growth in the 1800s like San Francisco or New York. Its population remained under 10,000 until it finally got a connection to the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1880s. I actually visited the depot where passengers would first arrive in the city. It's now a museum, and some of my footage is from there. The railroad provided a link to the rest of the world, and it triggered a real estate boom. Constructions of famous structures like the Hotel del Coronado began, and many investors arrived in the city to capitalize on the ever-increasing land value. Enter millionaire John D. Spreckels, a man who would eventually own much of the city. Spreckels was incredibly wealthy before he became the one man in the one-man town of San Diego. John's father, Klaus Spreckels, immigrated to New York from Hanover and lived a real up-by-your-bootstraps story. Something the book I read for this, Rails of the Silver Gate, would not shut up about. Klaus inherited the qualities of his ancestors: adventurous daring, stubborn determination, absolute self-reliance, and genius. We'll get more into this book later. Klaus came to America broke. He eventually owned multiple New York properties, moved out west, and started a financial empire. John Spreckels would expand this empire. Born in 1853, he inherited many family traits and became a great dreamer and a builder. He did big things. So many big things. Oh, sorry, it's the book again. Those who ever expected him to surrender and quit did not know J.D. Okay, sorry. I should stop. By the time Spreckels arrived in San Diego, he owned multiple banks, steamships, sugar plantations, a newspaper, you get it, both in Northern California and Hawaii. He saw a lot of potential in San Diego and decided to make it his personal project. He bought the island of Coronado, the famous hotel on it, the water supply, the San Diego Union, the Evening Tribune, and a lot of real estate. But in order for his investments to pay off, San Diego needed to grow into a real city. We're talking about Spreckels, since he knew this would only happen with reliable mass transit. Breaking news! 19th century robber baron has a better understanding of public transportation than many city governments today. Around 1900, San Diego had mostly unpaved streets with horse or steam-powered transportation. It wasn't much more than a pit stop. In fact, Spreckels only found the city while stopping for supplies. During the 1880s boom, some tried to modernize the network. One company ran experimental steam and electric trawlers up and down a few streets. Apparently, passengers marveled at the brilliant sparks from the revolving wheels, the mysterious power coming through the overhead wire. But the boom wouldn't last forever, and when it ended in the 1890s, many rail and horse car companies went out of business. Spreckels created the San Diego Electric Railway Company and began buying up, building, and electrifying many lines, until he owned the entire system. But for a private company like his to operate transit, they needed to be approved a 25-year license from the city. We'll get back to this later. Through the 1910s and 20s, San Diego was increasingly electrified and built up, though its population remained relatively small at around 40,000. The city thought they could capitalize on this by hosting a World's Fair in 1915 to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal, the Panama California Exposition. San Francisco decided to say fuck you to San Diego and create their own Panama Pacific International Exposition, a much more international name, that would run at the same time. San Francisco was by far the more influential city, and their bid won federal support. By the way, as part of the deal that allowed San Diego to hold their unauthorized exposition, San Francisco forced them to leave the international out of their name. San Diego had 1/10 the population, no federal support, and not much money. But with donations from Spreckels and many others, the city was able to create the famous Balboa Park to serve as the exposition grounds. To show the incoming millions of tourists that San Diego was a modern city, they created a new electric trolley line to the exposition. You can see the dramatic improvement in technology from this 1904 trolley to the 1915 exposition trolley. After the exposition, things got increasingly worse for the trolleys, as their finances began to suffer. The system saw increased ridership during the event, but it wasn't enough to cover their operating expenses. Additionally, by this point, private automobiles were stealing ridership from the trolleys. Something Spreckels pointed out violates his exclusive license. But wait a second, you told me licenses should only last 25 years, so how does Spreckels still have it? Well, in 1910, he argued that it was impossible to get investors while he had to ask the city for a renewal every 25 years. He needed more security to continue providing for the city, specifically a 50-year term. The city council opposed him, so he put the issue up for a vote, which won 2-1. The books I read for this video would tell you that this was beneficial for the city and was only opposed by demagogic politicians and their disgruntled and deluded followers, whose only chance for success lies in their ability to mobilize the forces of discontent and failure. That came from the man John D. Spreckels, his official biography. Oh yeah, we're getting into these Spreckels propaganda books. And for anyone wondering why I'm even reading 80-plus-year-old books that are clearly biased, well, they're the first things listed on the John D. Spreckels Wikipedia page. No other history books are referenced. So I was stuck listening to... Under the provisions of its charter, the city of San Diego could grant no franchises for longer than 25 years. It is a tale worth telling because it illustrates 3 things. 1. Why small men yelp at big men. 2. What a big man does to small men when they get in his way. And 3. That you can't fool people all the time. And the fight was on, but John D., just naturally, came out on top. He pocketed his losses without a whimper, grit his teeth, sawed wood, and waited. He was fighting to be allowed to build San Diego, and in spite of the efforts of all the petty politicians and small-town knockers, the people voted 2-1 to let him go right on investing million after million to benefit the city. He came, he saw, he visioned. Perhaps I may be pardoned for mentioning my own active participation in that memorable franchise fight. Hopefully you can understand why I was skeptical. Fortunately for me, I found a book, with sources, published in 2020, so my search could continue. Turns out Spreckels had a history of getting involved in local politics to serve his financial interests. Many of San Diego's progressives resented that he owned much of the city's municipal functions like water or transportation, and were attempting to make reforms. To counter those hostile to him, Spreckels recruited and poured money into supportive candidates. Unlike larger cities, millionaire Spreckels had an outsized influence in small San Diego. One critic called the city Spreckelsville by the Sea. If you remember, Spreckels owned a couple newspapers. He used these to propagandize to voters about the incredible investments he planned to make and what benefits they would gain from it, and how much his critics sucked. But despite this opposition, he consistently gained support from voters to expand his hold of the city. They seemed to believe life was pretty good in the one-man town. By this time, Spreckels companies could have been paying 10% of the city's taxes, and 1 out of every 15 residents was a Spreckels employee. Back to the streetcars' declining revenue and, the entire premise of this video. Maybe went a little bit off track there. The big thing during this time period was the ever-increasing presence of the car. In addition to the problem of private cars and buses capturing ridership from trolleys, they caused massive gridlock. Ah yes, a video about transit in America would not be complete if we didn't talk about traffic. Trolleys used to share the road with slow pedestrians or slow horse cars, but now they shared it with fast automobiles who would damage the roads and cut off the trolleys. A lot of streetcar companies were required to maintain their own roads and tracks, which made a lot of sense when they ruled the road. But now they were practically subsidizing the automobiles that were bankrupting them. These and other factors led to more and more lines suffering financial trouble after 1920. In this environment of uncertainty, in 1926, Spreckels died. He was by far the largest funder of the system and believed in its effectiveness. Those who managed his holdings afterwards were less interested. Though the streetcars were still the major form of urban transportation through the 1930s, sustained losses required massive service reductions. When the United States joined World War II in 1941, scarcity of materials for car manufacturing and an influx of military personnel increased ridership as the city scraped together all the streetcars it could. But this didn't lead to any lasting changes, so the end of the war was also the end of the streetcars. For decades now, city officials had been eager to phase out the trolleys, possibly because they wanted the sleek, modern image that the automobile had been marketed as, or possibly because the automotive industry was buying up and dismantling all the streetcar lines. That's right, a holding company named National City Lines was going around San Diego purchasing trolleys. It was funded by such companies as General Motors, Standard Oil of California, now Chevron, and Firestone Tire. Its express purpose was to purchase streetcar lines, destroy them, and replace them with buses. More and more trolley lines were shut down, their tracks either torn up or covered in asphalt, and their stations destroyed. In 1948, the Spreckels interests sold the transit system to J.L. Hogg, who intended to finally replace every trolley with a bus, making San Diego the first major city to do so. Now, Hogg is an interesting guy, because in 1946, he was the director of a certain streetcar holding company. Yeah, he was in contact with the auto industry for years and received jobs and money. Hogg also owned other streetcar lines across the country that were bought up by GM. This wasn't something unique to San Diego. This was part of the nationwide effort by the auto industry to destroy public transportation and replace it with cars. It even has its own Wikipedia page called the General Motors Streetcar Conspiracy. In 1949, after a federal antitrust investigation, multiple automotive companies, including GM, Chevron, and Firestone Tire, were convicted of attempting to monopolize the sale of buses and related supplies to national city lines. They dismantled the streetcar so they could monopolize the sale of the buses that would replace it. April 24, 1949 was the final day of streetcar operation in San Diego. Some of the oldest cars took their last trip from Balboa Park to a warehouse. Many nostalgic riders hopped on to witness the ending of an era. The procession was led by a 25-piece band. 45 glistening GM buses followed behind like a conquering army. The loss of the streetcar systems coincided with the great exodus to the suburbs. This was only made possible when the government used an incredible amount of public investment to build up the highway infrastructure, which nobody ever argued should have to make a profit like they did with the trolleys, but whatever. San Diego still has a long way to go. After all, there are still many lines over 100 years old that have yet to be rebuilt, like a line to Balboa Park. Yeah, one of the biggest tourist traps in the city doesn't have a trolley connection. But let's be optimistic as we ride the Blue Line extension into the sunset